The auctioneer couldn't even get a $500 opening bid for the 300 acres of alkaline wasteland known as the Bone Flats. Every veteran rancher in the room scoffed. Then a 15-year-old girl raised her numbered paddle. They called her a fool. They had no idea what she knew. The Malheur County Courthouse in eastern Oregon smelled of stale coffee floor wax, and the quiet desperation of men who owed more to the bank than the sky had given them in rain. It was August 2018. The temperature outside was a punishing 104 degrees, and the air conditioning inside the cramped auction room had surrendered 3 hours ago. Sitting in the back row, his custom-tooled ostrich leather boots resting casually on the pew in front of him, was Therese Reddick. Reddick owned the Double R, an 18,000-acre cattle empire that swallowed up everything in the valley. He had built his fortune not just on beef, but on water. Decades earlier, his father had successfully petitioned to dam the surface runoff of the Upper Creek, legally redirecting the lifeblood of the valley onto Reddick land. In doing so, he had systematically starved out the smaller neighboring farms, buying up their foreclosed dirt for pennies on the dollar. The next parcel on the docket was Tract 44, locally mocked as the Bone Flats. It was 300 acres of cracked white alkali dirt. Nothing grew there except stunted sagebrush and cheat grass. In the 1920s, a homesteader had tried to run sheep on it and went mad from the blowing dust. For the last 40 years, it had been a county tax burden, a dead zone that not even the jackrabbits bothered to cross. All right, moving on to Tract 44. The auctioneer droned, wiping a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. 300 acres, no surface water rights, no structural improvements. The county assessor's opening bid at $10,000. Silence hung in the sweltering room. A few ranchers chuckled. Reddick leaned over to his foreman, a burly man named Cobb, and muttered loudly enough for the room to hear, "I wouldn't pay $10 for that chalk. You'd have to feed cattle gravel to get 'em to graze it." "Do I hear 5,000? The auctioneer asked, his voice entirely devoid of hope. "5 anyone." More silence. The auctioneer sighed, preparing to strike it from the day's ledger and return it to the county's ever-growing pile of dead assets. $4,500. Final call. In the third row, a paddle shot up. It wasn't held by a weathered rancher or a corporate agricultural rep. The paddle belonged to Aurora Evans. She was 15 years old, wearing faded denim jeans, permanently stained with Axle grease, and a plain white t-shirt. Her hands gripping the plastic handle of the paddle were heavily calloused. For the past 5 years, while her peers were at summer camps or scrolling on their phones, Aurora had been mucking stalls at Pioneer Feed and Supply, fixing broken tractors, and raising prize-winning hogs for the 4-H circuit. Every single dollar she had ever earned had gone into a rusted metal lockbox beneath her bed. The auctioneer blinked, squinting through the hazy room. "I have $4,500 from bidder number 17. The room collectively turned. Reddick lowered his boots from the pew, his brow furrowing. He recognized the girl. She was Henry Evans's granddaughter. Henry was one of the small-time farmers Reddick had bankrupted 20 years ago by choking off the creek. The old man had died with nothing, and the Evans family had been renting a double-wide trailer on the edge of town ever since. "Are you sure, little lady?" the auctioneer asked gently. "This is a binding legal contract." "I have a cashier's check in my pocket for the exact amount, sir," Aurora said. Her voice was quiet, but it possessed a titanium steadiness that made the older men in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Paddle 17 bids 4,500. The auctioneer looked around. "Any counterbids? 5,000? Reddick snorted in amusement. He wasn't going to spend a dime to stop a teenager from buying a graveyard. "Let the kid have her sandbox," he called out. "Going once," the auctioneer said. "Going twice, sold. Tract 44 to bidder 17. The gavel cracked. It was the sound of Aurora's entire life savings vanishing. As the room began to empty, Reddick deliberately altered his path to the exit, stopping at the end of Aurora's row. He looked down at her, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. "You know, sweetheart, loyalty to your grandpa's memory is a nice thing." But he went broke because he didn't understand how the world works. You just bought yourself 300 acres of talcum powder. If you want, I'll let you pay my boys to haul your garbage out there, just so the land has some use. Aurora didn't flinch. She looked up at him, her green eyes unnervingly calm. "Mr. Reddick, you only own the water you can see." Reddick's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Then he shook his head, laughed dismissively, and walked out into the glaring Oregon sun. He didn't know about the record. 6 months prior, the Vale Public Library had experienced a flooded basement. Aurora, volunteering to help box up water-damaged archives, had stumbled upon a mouldering leather-bound logbook misfiled under the county tax rolls of the 1890s. It wasn't a tax record. It was the field diary of William H. Brewer, a geological surveyor commissioned by the federal government in 1898 to map the subterranean structures of the Western Basin. While modern ranchers relied on satellite imagery and surface water rights, Brewer had been looking downward. He was a master of topography and geological pressure systems. Aurora had spent 3 months meticulously translating Brewer's faded cursive script and archaic coordinate system. She cross-referenced his notes with modern U.S. Geological Survey maps, teaching herself hydrology late into the night. What she found made her heart hammer against her ribs. Brewer hadn't just walked the bone flats, he had sounded them. Beneath the cracked alkali crust lay a 50-foot dome of impermeable basalt and limestone. And beneath that capstone, Brewer had mapped a massive trapped glacial aquifer. It was a subterranean pressure anomaly. The surface of Tract 44 was dead precisely because the water was perfectly sealed beneath it, boiling with hydrostatic pressure, unable to seep upward. Reddick had spent 50 years fighting over the trickle of a surface creek, completely ignorant of the silent underground river flowing directly beneath the land he had deemed worthless. The bone flats weren't a desert. They were a vault, and Aurora had just bought the key. Stepping onto Tract 44 felt like walking on the surface of the moon. The earth crunched under Aurora's boots, throwing up puffs of fine white dust that coated the back of her throat. Heat waves shimmered violently across the flat expanse, distorting the horizon, where Reddick's lush green irrigated pastures began just behind a barbed wire fence. She wasn't alone. Standing next to her, looking at the wasteland with profound skepticism, was Martin Hayes. Marty was 62, with a face like a worn leather saddle and hands permanently stained with machine grease. He was an independent wildcatter and well driller who had been slowly driven out of business by the massive corporate agricultural outfits Reddick employed. Marty was broke bitter and operating a rusted, groaning 1998 Ingersoll Rand T4W drill rig that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. Aurora had approached him the previous afternoon with her remaining $3,000 money she had borrowed from a sympathetic high school agriculture teacher. "I'm telling you, kid, this is a fool's errand," Marty said, kicking at the crusted dirt. "I know this valley. I've drilled half the wells in it. There's nothing under here but solid basalt capstone. It's too hard, it's too thick, and it'll chew my diamond bits to pieces. Even if we punch through, there's no guarantee there's a drop of moisture down there." Aurora unrolled a heavily laminated topographical map on the hood of Marty's truck. Overlaid on the modern map were the coordinates and calculations she had extracted from Brewer's 1898 diary. "Look at the fault line, Mr. Hayes," Aurora said, pointing a grease-stained finger at a convergence of contour lines. The runoff from the Owyhee Mountains doesn't just evaporate, it sinks. The limestone cap here traps it. Brewer mapped a hydrostatic pressure dome right beneath us. We don't need to find a pool of water, we just need to puncture the ceiling of the pressure chamber. Marty stared at the teenage girl, entirely bewildered by her grasp of geology. You're betting your whole life on a hunch written by a dead guy in a top hat over a century ago. I'm betting on the math, Aurora corrected. The math doesn't lie. Will you drill? Marty looked out toward the distant fence line of the Double R Ranch. He hated Tyrese Reddick more than he hated going broke. All right, kid, where do you want the bit? The next 2 days were a descent into mechanical hell. The noise of the Ingersoll Rand was deafening, a relentless, shrieking, mechanical roar that echoed across the desolate basin. By the time they hit 40 feet, the drill bit slammed into the basalt layer. The entire rig shuddered violently. Progress slowed to a miserable crawl, less than a foot an hour. The August sun beat down relentlessly, pushing the temperature to 106. Aurora didn't retreat to the shade of the truck. She stood by the rig, covered in white dust, helping Marty wrestle heavy steel casing pipes into place, her muscles burning her hands, blistered despite her work gloves. On the afternoon of the second day, a shiny black Ford F250 crawled to a stop on the dirt road bordering the property. Tyrese Reddick stepped out, leaving the engine running and the AC blasting. He walked over to the property line, leaning against a cedar fence post. Marty killed the drill engine to inspect a smoking bit, allowing an eerie silence to fall over the flats. You lost your mind, Marty, Reddick called out across the dirt. Drilling in the bone flats. You're burning diesel for nothing. Who's paying you? The girl. Marty wiped grease from his forehead with a rag. None of your damn business, Tom. Reddick's eyes narrowed. I got a dozen new irrigation wells that need punching next spring on the south pasture. You keep entertaining this little girl's science project, and I'll make sure you never get a single one of those contracts. I'll bring a crew in from Idaho. Pack up your rig and get off this dust bowl. Marty gripped the heavy wrench in his hand, his knuckles turning white. He looked at Aurora, who was staring back at him, her expression a mix of fear and desperate defiance. She knew Marty needed Reddick's future business to survive. Marty spat into the dust, looked Reddick dead in the eye, and shouted, I wouldn't take your money if I was starving to death in a ditch, Tom. He turned to Aurora. Fire the compressor, Abby. We're going deeper. Reddick's face darkened into a furious scowl. He got back into his truck, slammed the door, and sped off in a cloud of dust. By the morning of the third day, the situation was critical. They were down to their last 100 gallons of diesel. The drill was howling in protest, the bit glowing dangerously hot as it ground against the ancient, unforgiving rock. Marty's pressure gauges were vibrating wildly. We're at 210 feet, Abby! Marty shouted over the roar of the engine. Your book said the cap was 200 feet down. We missed it, or it was never there. I have to pull up, or the bit is going to shatter in the hole and destroy my rig. Panic flared in Aurora's chest. Her money was gone. If they pulled up now, Tract 44 would remain a wasteland forever, and her grandfather's legacy would be truly erased. She scrambled onto the bed of the truck, grabbing her notebook. She stared at Brewer's calculations. 200 feet. But that was in 1898. Aurora looked around at the dusty landscape, her mind racing. A century of severe wind erosion. The surface level of the bone flats had been scoured away, but the dirt had piled up in dunes in this specific depression where they were drilling. The elevation had changed. 10 more feet! Aurora screamed over the machinery running to the edge of the drill platform. The surface soil drifted. Give me 10 more feet, Marty. It's going to blow the transmission. Marty yelled back, but when he looked at the sheer, unyielding fire in the 15-year-old girl's eyes, he couldn't bring his hand to pull the throttle back. He gritted his teeth and pushed the lever forward. "Hold on." At 218 feet, the rig's engine suddenly screamed as resistance vanished. The bit had punched through the ceiling. Before Marty could react, a massive guttural rumble echoed from deep within the earth. The steel rig shook so violently that Aurora was thrown to her knees in the dirt. "Get back!" Marty roared, diving off the control platform. A high-pitched hiss of escaping compressed air shrieked from the drill casing, followed by a deafening, thunderous roar. Then the water hit. It didn't just flow, it erupted. A solid, violent column of crystal-clear, freezing water blasted out of the 8-inch steel casing, shooting 40 feet into the pale blue Oregon sky. The sheer hydrostatic force of the trapped glacial aquifer, caged for tens of thousands of years beneath the rock, had finally found its release. The geyser cascaded down upon them in a torrential, icy downpour. Within seconds, the parched, white alkali dust of the bone flats was churning into rich, dark, saturated mud. Aurora knelt in the muck, completely drenched the freezing water plastering her hair to her face. She held out her trembling hands, catching the water, and brought it to her lips. It was sweet, pure, and agonizingly cold. Marty was laughing hysterically, dancing in the muddy deluge like a madman, his face turned upward to the falling water. "It's an artesian well, it's a goddamn artesian well, Abby. It's pumping thousands of gallons a minute, and there isn't a pump attached. The pressure is doing it all." Aurora stood up slowly, looking through the heavy veil of falling water toward the distant fence line of the Double R Ranch. Tract 44 wasn't dead. It was sitting on top of the largest independent, undammed water source in the entire county, and Aurora Evans owned every single drop of it. By May of 2019, the bone flats were unrecognizable. The blinding white alkali dust had been churned, heavily amended, with gypsum and organic compost Aurora had negotiated on credit and transformed into 300 acres of the most vibrant emerald green alfalfa malheur county had ever seen. The artesian well, properly capped with a manifold system by Marty Hayes, delivered a staggering 3,000 gallons a minute. Because it was pressurized by the earth itself, Aurora didn't have to spend a single dime on electricity to pump it, while neighboring farms bled money to run massive diesel turbines to draw water tract. 44 practically irrigated itself. But across the barbed wire fence, Tyrese Reddick was seething. Reddick stood on the porch of his sprawling ranch house, a pair of Zeiss binoculars pressed to his eyes. He watched the massive irrigation pivots spinning across the teenage girl's land, casting rainbows in the morning mist. His own pastures, dependent on the surface creek he had monopolized for decades, were starting to show the yellowing signs of an unseasonably dry spring. "She's stealing it!" Reddick snarled, slamming the binoculars onto a patio table. His lawyer, Richard Cleary, sighed from the patio chair. "Tom, she's not. I've pulled the geological surveys. That aquifer is entirely confined. It doesn't connect to your creek or your shallow wells. She found a deep earth anomaly." "I don't care what she found," Reddick roared. "She's a 15-year-old kid making a mockery of me. Every rancher in the basin is laughing behind my back. Get a judge to shut her down. File an injunction. Claim she's violating the basin's conservation limits." Cleary rubbed his temples. "I tried. But the morning after she bought the land, before she even hired the driller, she filed a historic groundwater registration claim under an 1898 federal survey. Because the water was catalogued by a federal agent prior to the 1909 Oregon Water Rights Act, it falls under a grandfathered exemption. Her paperwork is bulletproof." Reddick's face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. If the law couldn't crush Aurora Evans, he would have to use the blunt instruments that had built the Double R empire in the first place. 3 nights later, a heavy, unseasonal fog rolled into the valley, blanketing Tract 44 in absolute darkness. Aurora was asleep on a cot in the cramped metal tool shed she and Marty had erected near the wellhead. She practically lived on the property now, leaving only for school and to check on her grandfather's old farmhouse, which she was saving to buy back. At 2 in the morning, the harsh bark of Marty's rescue dog, a battered blue heeler named Rusty, shattered the silence. Aurora jolted awake. She didn't turn on the lights. She slipped into her boots, grabbed a heavy 6-cell steel flashlight, and crept out the side door. The humid air was thick, but through the fog she could hear the distinct, muffled clanking of heavy metal. She moved silently through the tall, wet alfalfa, navigating by memory toward the wellhead. As she drew closer, she saw the faint outlines of 3 men surrounding her primary manifold. A heavy dual-axle flatbed truck was parked without its headlights on, idling softly. In the back of the truck were 2 massive vats of quick-setting industrial concrete. They were going to pour concrete down the casing. They were going to kill the well. Aurora recognized the hulking silhouette of Reddick's foreman Cobb, holding a heavy pipe wrench preparing to crack the main valve cover off the well. Panic seized her throat, but it was instantly swallowed by a fierce protective rage. This wasn't just dirt and water. This was her grandfather's vindication. "Hey," Aurora shouted, stepping out of the alfalfa and clicking on her heavy flashlight, blinding the 3 men with the high lumen beam. Cobb cursed, shielding his eyes. "Grab the kid and toss her in the shed," he barked to his hands. "We finish the pour tonight." 2 of the ranch hands started toward her. Aurora backed up her heart, hammering against her ribs. She was tough, but she was a teenager facing grown men. Suddenly, a deafening mechanical roar split the night. Marty Hayes stepped out from the shadows behind the manifold. He hadn't brought a gun. He had brought something much better. He had his hands on the massive cast-iron lever of the agricultural pressure bypass valve, the emergency release for the artesian well. "You boys look a little thirsty," Marty bellowed. He threw the lever. A jet of freezing, highly pressurized water, backed by thousands of pounds of subterranean hydrostatic force, erupted from the 8-inch release cannon. It hit the 2 approaching ranch hands with the force of a runaway freight train. The men were lifted entirely off their feet, thrown backward 10 yards into the mud, coughing and screaming. Cobb tried to run, but Marty tracked him with the valve handle, swinging the massive jet of water across the muddy ground. The blast caught Cobb perfectly in the chest, sweeping his legs out from under him and pinning him brutally against the side of his own flatbed truck. The freezing water hammered him relentlessly. "Turn it off! Turn it off!" Cobb screamed, pinned against the metal, gasping for air. Aurora walked calmly through the mud, the flashlight beam fixed on the drenched, defeated foreman. "Tell Reddick," Aurora said, her voice cutting clearly through the roar of the water, "that if anyone from the Double R ever steps foot on the Bone Flats again, I won't just wash you away. I'll have the sheriff arrest you for federal water tampering, and I will personally make sure the state takes his ranch." She nodded to Marty. He pulled the lever back and the thunderous water cannon silenced. Cobb and his men scrambled into their truck like beaten dogs and sped off into the fog, leaving their concrete behind. The sabotage attempt was the last desperate gasp of a dying empire, though Reddick didn't know it yet. Nature was about to do what Aurora didn't have to. July brought the most severe drought eastern Oregon had seen in 60 years. A high-pressure heat dome parked itself over the valley, baking the earth at 110 degrees for 3 straight weeks. The snowpack in the Owyhee Mountains, usually the reliable savior of the valley's summer, had melted out 2 months early. By the first week of August, The surface creek that fed Reddick's 18,000 acres didn't just slow down. It stopped. The creek bed turned into cracked brown clay. The Double R Ranch was entirely dependent on surface water. Reddick's shallow 50-foot wells tied to the creek's water table began sucking mud, then nothing at all. His sprawling empire of pasture grass turned brown, then brittle, then to dust. Worse, he had 4,000 head of prime black Angus cattle scattered across the valley. Without water and with no grass to graze, they were dropping dead in the blistering heat. Reddick frantically called trucking companies to haul water in from Idaho, but the logistics were impossible, and the costs astronomical. The bank, seeing his assets withering by the hour, froze his credit lines. The man who had starved out dozens of families was now watching his own legacy turn to ash. Meanwhile, Tract 44 was an oasis. The deep glacial aquifer was entirely immune to the surface drought. Aurora's alfalfa grew so thick and fast, she was cutting it every 28 days. The towering stacks of premium hay bales on her property looked like bars of solid gold. On a blistering Tuesday afternoon, a black Ford F250 pulled up to the gated entrance of Tract 44. It wasn't driving fast. It crept up the gravel drive and parked near the massive hay barn. Tyrese Reddick stepped out. He looked 20 years older. His posture, normally rigid with arrogance, was stooped. His face was deeply lined with exhaustion and defeat. Aurora was sitting on the tailgate of Marty's truck, meticulously logging her harvest yields into a ledger. She didn't look up as Reddick approached. "Miss Evans," Reddick said. His voice was entirely stripped of its former mockery. It was hollow. Aurora closed the ledger and looked at him. "Mr. Reddick, you're trespassing." "I need feed," Reddick said, staring at the ground, unable to meet the 15-year-old's eyes. "And I need water. My cattle are dying. The state won't let me drill deep enough fast enough, and Marty is the only one who knows the basin's deep geology, and he won't take my calls." Aurora let the silence stretch. She looked at the sprawling, dead brown hills in the distance that belonged to the man standing before her. She remembered the day her grandfather had to sell his tractor, the tears in his eyes, as he told a 7-year-old Aurora that they had to leave their home. "I have 3,000 tons of premium alfalfa ready for transport," Aurora said evenly. "And my irrigation trucks can haul 20,000 gallons of water a day to your troughs." Reddick looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "I'll pay double the market rate. I'll sign a promissory note right now." "I don't want your money, Mr. Reddick," Aurora said. "You're over-leveraged. Your promissory notes are worthless." Reddick's face fell. "Then what do you want?" "You want to watch my herd die to punish me." "I don't punish animals for the sins of the rancher," Aurora replied, hopping down from the tailgate. She pulled a folded legal document from her back pocket. She had prepared it weeks ago, knowing this day was mathematically inevitable. "This is a deed of transfer," Aurora said, handing him the paper. "For 500 acres, specifically the 500 acres encompassing the old Evans homestead, bordering the creek. You are going to sign it over to me, free and clear, permanently breaking your monopoly on the valley's surface rights. In exchange, I will supply you with enough feed and water to keep your herd alive until the autumn rains come." Reddick stared at the paper. It was a humiliating defeat. Giving up the Evans tract meant conceding the very center of his empire. But looking at the unyielding teenage girl, he knew she held his entire life in her calloused hands. With a shaking hand, Reddick pulled a silver pen from his shirt pocket, flattened the deed against the hood of the truck, and signed his name. Aurora took the paper, inspected the signature, and nodded. "Marty will start loading the water trucks in an hour. Cobb can send his rigs for the hay." As Reddick drove away, a broken man in a dusty truck, Marty walked out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the signed deed in Aurora's hand and grinned. "You did it, kid," Marty said softly. Henry would be proud. Aurora looked out over the thriving green oasis of Tract 44, feeling the cool mist from the irrigation sprinklers on her face. She hadn't just bought the dead land no one wanted. She had brought it back to life, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her family's name. The Bone Flats were dead. The Evans Ranch had just been born. What an incredible journey of a brilliant teenager, outsmarting a greedy empire using nothing but forgotten history and relentless determination. Aurora proved that true value isn't always what's on the surface. Sometimes you have to dig deeper. If you loved this inspiring, true-to-life story of justice, strategy, and underdog victory, please hit that like button, share it with your friends to spread the inspiration, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories like this.